This is Dr. Stephen Cangiano. I am the president and co-founder of RDT.Media and Events with its online companions, humanity-upgrade.com, relationship-upgrade.com. I'm here today with Ray Williams. Ray is extremely popular on the site, and I wanted to have you meet him today. And he has an exceptionally interesting career, a lot of great accomplishments. I'm going to give you a potted version of those because it would take about 10 minutes to give them all. Ray is the founder of Ray Williams Associates. He is a master executive coach. He's considered one of Canada's top executive coaches. He spent 35 years in business, CEO, HR director, management consultant. And he's been in too many magazines and too many news stations to even mention all the big ones that you know. And we were just talking before we started here about his new book. And then at the end, we're going to talk about his upcoming book briefly. His new book is I Know Myself and Neither Do You, which is an intriguing title. But Ray, before we get into the book, give me a potted version of, did I miss anything in that intro? And it's really nice to have you.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate the invitation. No, I think that's a good encapsulation. What I've always found is that, and a great, always give credit to my father. He says, if you have intros that are excessively long, you're probably just padding your ego. So I'll kind of leave it at that.
Well, that's not your style to pad your ego. Let's start with your book because it's really intriguing and I think it kind of leads into a lot of the things we want to discuss. So how did you come up with this title? I Know Myself and Neither Do You.
Well, I've been doing research about the last 3 or 4 years based upon my concerns because I coach a lot of presidents and owners of organizations and CEOs, which is sort of where my focus is on doing executive coaching. And I've really been concerned about the high failure rate. Why were so many of them not doing well, number one. Number two, why did so many of them have employees that hated their guts, that did not like them, did not like working there, but only continued to work there because they needed a job? And number three, is why were organizations recruiting those kinds of individuals? So that really concerned me. So I started to look in the research about what are the causes of it, and there's quite a bit written on it, but they seem to come down to sort of two essential elements, and they're really connected. One's part of the other. Number one is their lack of emotional intelligence. And for too long, we've recruited executives based upon their expertise, their knowledge, their education, their technical knowledge, and often their personality. And their personalities tended to be extroverts, very dominating, forceful individuals, mostly men. And so that kind of led me to looking at the research about what are some other explanations for failure? And what I came up with is, in addition to the lack of emotional intelligence, is so many of them lacked self-awareness. So, and what I mean by self-awareness is they lack the ability to understand themselves internally. So there's an internal and external component to this. They really didn't know who they were. They had developed a persona, a projection, almost like they were salespeople. Secondly, is the external, is that they didn't see themselves the way other people saw them. There is a real disconnect. And so therefore, their actions that they took, their behavior, were out of alignment. So when I started writing the book, I actually had a title that said Developing Your Self-Awareness, and that just didn't have a punch to it. And then I had a discussion with a longtime colleague of mine in Arizona who said, maybe what you need to do is to kind of turn it around and saying, well, you can say I know myself, but someone else can say, well, I know myself too. And then your response is, no, well, actually you don't. Well, then that applies to you. So I wanted to be able to give them that way of kind of double checking, what does that mean, in order to look at this issue of self-awareness, which I think is so critical.
Yes, yeah, very well said. You know, as I'm listening to you, I had the opportunity to really do my research, and I watched all of your videos on your website. Not only are they extremely well produced and well done, I highly recommend them to everyone. You really focus on something that I think is crucial. It's this mindfulness, and as you already mentioned, self-awareness. And a lot of times people don't think of that. They think of competence in the workplace rather than self-awareness. So how tell me, well, emotional intelligence is really super important, but tell me how the mindfulness, self-awareness, how that fits into a tough business environment.
Right. So one of the things I describe in my book, and also my previous one, Stephen, which is about mindfulness. My previous book was called um, uh, Eye of the Storm, how mindful leaders can transform chaotic organizations. And one of the things I talked about in that book, which connects to the self-awareness book, is that if you look at the behavior of the executives that I've worked with, many of the top leaders, they're in a constant rush all the time. At back-to-back meetings, unbelievably busy schedules, um, long working hours, a lot of stress. They don't have the time to be able to actually sit and reflect on, how am I feeling about what I just did? How are other people feeling about what just transpired? What do I need to do next before they rush into the next meeting? So there's no reflection time. There's no self-examination time. Not only from the point of view of thinking, but also, how am I feeling? What are my emotions about this? And we all know, and you know as well, Stephen, is that emotional intelligence means having an intelligence about your emotional state and being sensitive to other people's emotional state.
Yes, yeah, I did a little homework on emotional intelligence, and it's self-awareness, which you are an expert at, self-control, empathy, and skilled relationship. And I really like how you thread that into the management of, and quite honestly, Ray, it sounds like this is important for anybody, family, management, society, church, etc. Draw the distinction for me, because I think this is an important point, about internal and external self-awareness. If you could just give us dial in a little more detail on that.
Sure. So let me give you an example of actually a meeting, a coaching session I had with a senior executive just recently. Is he's part of an executive team in an organization that's going through tremendous change and tremendous pressure and restructuring, partly because of the economy the way it is now, but they were heading that way anyway. And when we talked in our coaching session, he says, oh, I'm so frustrated because we're not getting anywhere, and so is doing this, and they're being obstreperous, and we can't seem to reach agreement, and we've got to have such and such a plan ready in 30 days and start executing and inform the employees, and we've got to lay off some people. And I said to him, I said, well, how are you feeling about that? And there was this big silence. There's this big silence. And he said, well, what do you mean? And then he described his thoughts about it again in concrete terms. And I said, that's not what I'm asking you. I said, how are you feeling about it internally? And what he pointed out was, the problem here is that he doesn't take the time to reflect on what are his emotions as he's going through a stressful situation, and be able to talk to himself about that, which would enable him to move to an action orientation, being much more in touch with his internal state. Same thing as he's having a conversation with somebody else. And it's a stressful conversation or one that's full of conflict. To be able to say to him later, well, how are you feeling about that conversation? And the response was, again, a thinking response. Well, he shouldn't have done this and that, and his point of view about this and that was incorrect. And I said, well, how do you feel about that? And he says, well, what do you mean by how do you feel? I said, do you feel frustrated, angry, fearful? What is it? And he says, I don't know. So part of this internal thing is being in touch with your feelings at the time you're going through a particular event is really, really critical, because that changes two things. One is it changes your response to the event or the person. But in addition to that, neuroscientists have been able to show that just the process of reflecting on your emotions and labeling them has a way of calming down the primitive part of your brain, which has a tendency to fight or flight.
You know, I'm glad you said the word neuroscientist, because in all your work, I see this thread of knowledge that underlies what you're doing that is based, correct me if I'm wrong, in neuroscience principles. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So what I try and do is, rather than just with my executives I'm working with, where I say, well, this is my opinion based upon a situation, I'm saying, well, this is my perception based upon my experience, but I'd like to also provide to you some research evidence about the way the brain works that supports what I'm saying.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I can see that. And it's like, and you have these 10 principles, which I thought were phenomenal. I want to, we probably don't have time to do all 10, but I do want to approach a couple of them. You talk about, let's just, the first two. The first one is focus, attention. And then you talk about mastering meditation. And you can see that you have some in-depth knowledge of neuroplasticity, because you ask people to, yeah, you know, that they can actually, that part of their brain grows. Why don't you give them a little, give us a little cash value on that insight, which I think is great.
Okay, so glad to. Let's take the first one, is focus your attention. What I've observed, and you've probably seen this too in meetings, an executive would be sitting there and they're taking part in a discussion with team members or colleagues, their executive team, and at the same time, they're looking at messages on their phone or their laptop, or they're looking at papers for an upcoming meeting that have nothing to do with the meeting they're in. So what I've observed through time is, because their schedules are so packed, because they're so busy, that they've learned to multitask, and multitasking has been shown by lots of research to lower your cognitive functioning. You don't function as well when you multitask. So, but they've developed the habit of multitasking, being distracted, thinking about other things. That's kind of one level. The second level is the process of listening to the other person while you're engaged with them. And that occurs in two dimensions. The listening is, are you just waiting for what you're gonna say when it's your turn? And that's
Right.
the real listening, because you're actually formulating your conversation in your head in advance. Or are you really listening to the other person and then subsequently maybe asking a question or two? The second level of question or dimension of listening is, are you listening for emotional content? Can you guess from their body language and their tone of voice how they're feeling about what they're saying? So you may inquire about that too. So being able to focus your attention on what's before you, and developing habits that focus that attention, makes a huge difference, both in your level of emotional intelligence, but also your capacity to act as a leader.
Beautiful. It's fascinating to me because the threads of what you're doing, I'm sure you have the systems and structures and management down to, because you were in there for 35 years. But what you're bringing beyond the systems and structures is really fundamental principles in how to relate to people. There's another one I really liked, and this for not for me because I'm in the relationship magazine business, but you talk about non-judgmental and coming at people from not knowing, which is very counterintuitive for most people because in this society, knowing is so important. Why don't you kind of get into that a little bit? Because I think there's a million things we could talk about, but I think that's important as well.
Yeah, that's really important as your function as an executive, but also just generally in relationships as well. And that is, it's human nature for us to pass judgment about what the other person's about and what they have to contribute and the kind of person they are. And we tend to make those judgments really, really quickly. Matter of fact, there's one research study, Stephen, that says when you meet somebody for the first time, you make a decision about who they are within 4 seconds. So we really have to be careful about first impressions because they can be deceptive, and so to teach ourselves to resist that temptation to go on first impressions, your initial reaction is really important because what it does is it lends itself to being much more open-minded to people's perceptions, their perspectives. Which then lends you, okay, how do I do that? Well, let me ask more questions. Let me find out what they're thinking. You know, why do you believe what you do? I want to hear more about that. Explain it to me, as opposed to instantly judging them and responding the way you think things should be.
Beautiful. Yeah, no, that's well said, and and it's all these relationship threads go through your business. And just speaking with you, it's obvious you're a master of relationship, just in the preamble and as we go through this. Um, Another one, patience. Again, in business, in life, we've become so impatient and we try to force things. Tell people about how that is maybe counterproductive and counterintuitive.
Right. I think patience is so important. One of the things that has stopped us from being patient, maybe as we may have been way in the past, is the pace of life. And I've written an article called, "Are You Addicted to Busyness?" Busyness is not productivity. Seat time is not productivity. In other words, the more things you're doing during a day, the more meetings you go to, doesn't mean you're more productive. It just means you're busier. And the problem with being busy, where you're running from one meeting to another, one task for another at breakneck speed, is that you don't take the time to, number one, listen to other people, to find out their perspectives, to really reflect on what you're doing and how you're feeling about what you're doing. So if you develop patience, you slow things down. I really believe that less is more, and that we need to, for example, I really encourage my executives about when they have conversations with people. I said, listen 70% of the time, talk no more than 30% of the time. And
Right.
often it's the other way around. And so how can you have patience if you're constantly talking at people all the time?
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting. It's all much of it is really counterintuitive with the society we live in. I want to touch on a couple more things. Then I want to get because you're in the trenches with business every day. You've been in business for quite a while. I want to see what people can do today in your outlook. But let me a couple of other things that are just counterintuitive but in my opinion, critically important. Um, Open-heartedness. Now, that is not a typical business suggestion. You know, it's like, hey, tough, let's go, let's go, let's go, boom. Tell me how, two things, open-heartedness, and maybe you can combine in non-attachment. And number one, why it's important. Then I'm just kind of curious how it's perceived in the business world, regardless of how important it is.
Right. Very good question, Stephen. So another way of looking at open-heartedness is looking at the difference between hard skills and soft skills. So hard skills are technical skills, analytical skills, task skills, it's doing stuff. The soft skills are all wrapped around emotional intelligence, which is being able to listen empathetically. And one of the things they found in particularly more recent research studies, both by Harvard and Wharton School of Business and others, is that the soft skills in doing surveys of global leaders and companies throughout the world, not just in the United States and Canada, is that the importance of soft skills are skyrocketing to the top. And part of the reason for that is that so much of business now relies upon relationships, both to the customer as well as B2B. And it also revolves around relationships between leaders and their employees. And there is significant generational differences. Gen Y or millennials are much more prepared to leave their job if they're dealing with a boss who's an idiot, who's aggressive, who knows nothing about relationships. They have no hesitation to say, I'm out of here. And maybe baby boomers were not prepared to do that. So the generations have contributed to that. So open-heartedness involves things like empathy and compassion towards both your employees and your customers. And boy, is it ever in need right now, given the pandemic situation that we're in.
Yes, no doubt. And then there was one other thing you talk about in those 10 steps. I think the final one is non-attachment. And that is, again, to baby boomers like myself, us, it's like, that's counter, like you want to get that goal no matter what, even if it destroys your relationships, your health, your life, you know, everything else, that goal is the most important. Explain how, give us a little insight into non-attachment and why it is so important.
Yeah, it's both an attitude as well as a concrete practice. And non-attachment can really occur at two levels. One of them is that we're beginning to see that attachment to material goods, owning stuff and buying things, and the whole consumer economy has in many ways contributed to a lot of the problems that we have, particularly with respect to pollution and discarding things. And you just have to look at the garment industry as an example. So there are lots of people now who are questioning, you know, do I really need to own that? So the idea of minimalism, you know, am I really attached to having 25 shirts? Can I just get by with 3? So that's part of attachment. It's the physical attachment to things, not necessarily contributing to your happiness, as opposed to relationships contributing to your happiness, doing good for others contributing to happiness, taking care of our environment contributing to happiness. And they have nothing to do with owning anything. The second area of non-attachment is, and I deal with executives on this, is be careful about being attached to an answer or an outcome that is absolute, because that means that your open-mindedness and your open perspectiveness may be restricted as a result. There's always options and choices that we have in life. And we need to keep open to those as long as we can, as opposed to being fixed on the answer all the time.
Beautiful. Yeah, no, very well said. And that attack, like I like what you talk about, and it's a trend which I know you're familiar with, is dematerialization. Do we need all this stuff? Because consumerism has become a religion. I mean, it's gone to the heights of cheaper and cheaper, more and more products. And you're correct. It really has done many great disservices both in the environment and in society and in relationships. And I totally track with all of that. Okay, this is really good. Let's start to come in for a landing, but I really want to get to how you see the current marketplace and how you see people can survive. We talked about this a little bit in the preamble. With all of your experience, I would imagine you've never seen anything quite like this. How do people navigate this in a healthy and hopefully ultimately successful way?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you know, I don't have a crystal ball in terms of saying here are the answers, but you know, here's some thoughts and feelings that I have based upon my work with others. First of all, I think people right now are faced with value choices. What's the most important things in life right now to you? And are you clear about those values? And one of the things I start with in working with executives is really clarifying their values and their commitment to those values and how they show up in their lives. What do you believe in? What's most important to you? What's the behavior that you see? And an example of where some executives that I work with run into trouble, they say, well, family is my most important value. And I said, okay, so tell me, how many hours a week do you spend with your family versus work? And then there's this silence. Or they say, well, I really care about other people. And I say, well, in the past week, how many times have you reached out to your employees with empathy or compassion about situations in their life? How many times? Silence. So I think one of the things that we're facing right now is having people really examine what are the most important things in life. And I think there's some universals. So being able to live on a planet where we don't have severe climate issues, I think is an important value that we can all commit to. And so what do we need to do to get there? And it's going to probably involve some pain and sacrifice in order to get there. Number two, do we believe in equality really when income inequality is the worst in the United States of any of the developed countries and getting worse? Okay, if you believe in equality, then what kinds of things are you doing to support the notion of equality in your community, in your country? So I think that's kind of the starting place, Stephen, is to really, really look at your values and then look at your life and say, are my behaviors supporting those particular values?
That's beautiful. Love it. Yeah, and you really touched on a couple of important so the environment and in extreme inequality, and that's I think hopefully that's starting to be on people's mind because some of it really is I don't know if the obscene is the right word, but that's the word that comes to my mind in terms of the obscene inequality, which is totally unnecessary.
Yeah, I think there's a much greater level of awareness now. The test is going to be is what kind of actions actually take place.
Right, exactly, and that's what we need. We need to alter the systems and structures to encourage behaviors that we want. And there's a lot of mismatches and a lot of structural conflicts. And your approach is really one way I would classify it is you're helping people eliminate the internal structural conflicts so they can then bring that into the workplace and bring much more efficiency and effectiveness and correct me if I'm wrong, happiness, fulfillment, etc.
Yeah, exactly. That latter in particular, because what I've seen with executives that commit themselves to soft skills, to changing some behaviors, to really show compassion and caring for their employees. While it doesn't mean you can't, have some tough targets and objectives it doesn't mean you throw those out the window, but that those relationships and values are important. What I see is them being a lot happier in their lives as a result of taking that road.
Yeah. I would, I know you know this word, but I'm going to throw it in. And you are the epitome of a resonant leader. People that somebody wants to follow rather than has to follow. And I know you're familiar with that research. So I can't let you go before we talk about your next book. And we don't want to give too much of it away, but it's a really fascinating story. And you already promised me you're going to come back when you release that, and we're gonna help talk about it. But give us a little preamble to that, and then because it's really a fascinating story.
Sure. So my next book is based upon my family's experience, and what I try to incorporate into that are some of the things that I teach and coach around values and perseverance and survival, because my family survived through unbelievable hardship, and my father was the sort of the epitome and leader of that. The way he conducted himself in life is a man of great integrity. So from the time he grew up in Wales, and worked in a coal mine between the ages of 9 and 14. Never went to school, mostly self-educated, went on to serve in the British Army in the Mideast for 11 years, and then in the British Foreign Service. So what I try to show is through his eyes, the issue of that journey to Hong Kong from the point of view of what were the lessons learned about integrity, how to conduct yourself with honor, about caring for other people, about sacrifice, about kindness and love, love and compassion. And so the life story is wrapped around those values, and so I'm looking forward to being able to write it.
Yes, and there's some interesting story about how your family was actually in a prison / internment camp, and we don't want to give that away. But that is, I'm excited to see that and hear that. Ray, this has been phenomenal. Any last ideas, thoughts that you want to leave people with? As I said, this has been great.
Yeah, so two things, Stephen. One of them is what I see happening in leadership and organizations is an increasing number of better leaders coming into organizations where they are much more emotionally intelligent, much more concerned about relationships. I'm seeing a real increase in that because I think the old model is really being questioned a lot more. Unfortunately, it's not portrayed on the media yet as examples. We still gravitate towards the flamboyant extroverts as being examples of great leaders. But I think that's slowly changing. And I think one of the ways it's going to change is through women. Women have demonstrated clearly for modern times that they're actually much more effective leaders than men. And it's something that's hard for both men and organizations to really come to grips with. But there are lots of examples, during the pandemic, good examples, Angela Merkel in Germany, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. There's a study by Harvard that shows that women CEOs perform financially better for their company than men do on average. So there's lots of evidence you can point to. And I'm really optimistic about that as a trend as well. And then the final word I'd have, Stephen, is just to congratulate you on the work you're doing here and the efforts you're making. I think it's really valuable, and encourage and support you in doing that.
Well, Ray, this has been phenomenal. We appreciate your time. As I said, please go. We're going to have all those the how to contact Ray and on the show notes here. And you've got to look at his website, and he's really generous with just an abundance of useful information with a lot of practical applications. And some of it will surprise you as a business expert for 30, 40 years, and how he really goes into this emotional intelligence. And obviously you can tell by this interview, he is off the charts in emotional intelligence. Ray, it's been great having you. This is Dr. Stephen Cangiano signing off for RDT Media and Events. Thank you very much.